Interpretation. Metternich's goal was always a settlement that would best serve Austria's long-term interests. Those interests, he decided, involved not just preventing Russian intervention in Greece, but maneuvering the Tsar into permanently relinquishing the right to send troops into the Balkans, an enduring source of instability in Europe. So Metternich looked at the relative forces on both sides. What leverage did he have over the Russians? Very little. In fact, he had the weaker hand. But Metternich possessed a trump card: his years-long study of the Tsar's rather strange personality. Alexander was a highly emotional man who would act only in a state of exaltation. He had to turn everything into a crusade. So right at the beginning of the crisis, Metternich planted the seed that the real crusade here was one not of Christians against Turks, but of monarchies against revolution. Metternich also understood that his main enemy was Distria, and that he would have to drive a wedge between Distria and the Tsar. So he lured an envoy to Vienna. In one-on-one negotiations, Metternich was a chess player on the Grand Master level. With Tatishev, as with so many others, he first lowered his opponent's suspicions by playing the foppish, even dim-witted aristocrat. Next, he drew out the negotiations, miring them in abstract, legalistic discussions. That made him seem even more stupid, further misleading Tatishev, but also confusing and irritating him. A confused and riled negotiator is prone to make mistakes, such as reveal too much about what he is after, always a fatal error. A confused negotiator is also more easily seduced by emotional demonstrations. In this case, Metternich used the note from the Turks to stage a little drama in which he appeared to reveal a sudden change in his sympathies. That put Tatishev, and through him the Tsar, completely under his spell. From then on, it was child's play to reframe the discussion to suit Metternich's purpose. The offer to stage a conference, at which the Tsar would shine, was dazzling and alluring, and it also seemed to offer Russia the chance of greater influence in European affairs, one of Alexander's deepest desires. In fact, the result was the opposite. Alexander ended up signing a document that cut Russia out of the Balkans, Metternich's goal all along. Knowing how easily people are seduced by appearances, the Austrian minister gave the Tsar the appearance of power, being the center of attention at the conference, while he himself retained its substance, having the signed document. It is what the Chinese call giving someone a gaudy piece of painted tile in exchange for jade. As Metternich so often demonstrated, success in negotiation depends on the level of preparation. If you enter with vague notions as to what you want, you will find yourself shifting from position to position depending on what the other side brings to the table. You may drift to a position that seems appropriate, but does not serve your interests in the end. Unless you carefully analyze what leverage you have, your maneuvers are likely to be counterproductive. Before anything else, you must anchor yourself by determining with utmost clarity your long-term goals and the leverage you have for reaching them. That clarity will keep you patient and calm. It will also let you toss people meaningless concessions that seem generous but actually come cheap, for they do not hurt your real goals. Before the negotiations begin, study your opponents. Uncovering their weaknesses and unfulfilled desires will give you a different kind of leverage. The ability to confuse them, make them emotional, seduce them with pieces of tile. If possible, play a bit of the fool. The less people understand you and where you are headed, the more room you have to maneuver them into corners. By Prince Clemens von Metternich. Everyone wants something without having any idea how to obtain it. And the really intriguing aspect of the situation is that nobody quite knows how to achieve what he desires. But because I know what I want, and what the others are capable of, I am completely prepared. Keys to warfare. Conflict and confrontation are generally unpleasant affairs that churn up unpleasant emotions. Out of a desire to avoid such unpleasantness, people will often try to be nice and conciliatory to those around them, in the belief that they will elicit the same response in return. But so often experience proves this logic to be wrong. Over time, the people you treat nicely will take you for granted. They will see you as weak and exploitable. Being generous does not elicit gratitude, but creates either a spoiled child or someone who resents behavior perceived as charity. Those who believe against the evidence that niceness breeds niceness in return are doomed to failure in any kind of negotiation, let alone in the game of life. People respond in a nice and conciliatory way only when it is in their interest and when they have to do so. Your goal is to create that imperative by making it painful for them to fight. If you ease up the pressure out of a desire to be conciliatory and gain their trust, you only give them an opening to procrastinate, deceive, and take advantage of your niceness. That is human nature. Over the centuries, those who have fought wars have learned this lesson the hard way. When nations have violated this principle, the results are often tragic. In June 1951, for example, the U.S. military halted its extremely effective offensive against the Chinese People's Liberation Army in Korea because the Chinese and the North Koreans had signaled they were ready to negotiate. Instead, they drew out the talks as long as they could, while they recovered their forces and strengthened their defenses. When the negotiation failed and the war was resumed, the American forces found that their battlefield advantage was lost. This pattern was repeated in the Vietnam War, and to some extent in the Gulf War of 1991 as well. The Americans acted partly out of a desire to reduce casualties, partly to be seen as trying to bring these wars to an end as soon as possible, to appear conciliatory. What they did not realize was that the enemy's incentive to negotiate in good faith was lost in the process. In this case, trying to be conciliatory and save lives led to much longer wars, more bloodshed, real tragedy. Had the United States continued to advance in Korea in 1951, it could have compelled the Koreans and Chinese to negotiate on its own terms. Had it continued its bombing campaigns in Vietnam, it could have forced the North Vietnamese to negotiate instead of procrastinate. Had it continued its march all the way to Baghdad in 1991, it could have forced Saddam Hussein out of office as a condition of peace, preventing a future war and saving countless lives. The lesson is simple. By continuing to advance, by keeping up unrelenting pressure, you force your enemies to respond and ultimately to negotiate. If you advance a little further every day, attempts to delay negotiation only make their position weaker. You are demonstrating your resolve and determination, not through symbolic gestures, but by administering